Hello and welcome to this presentation on my developmental model, Transcendental Pluralism. Today I will give you a simple and time-saving introduction into the two types that my model can measure, the so-called Gestalt and Analytical types of language development. And we will focus on a certain trajectory or sequence of the overall spectrum of consciousness, namely from infancy to early adolescence, because language expression there is quite simple. And nevertheless, we can see the main interaction of transcendental media or transcendental structures, which are at the basis or are the foundation of my developmental model and how it's applied in developmental assessment. So focusing on these early stages makes it very palpable and accessible and keeps it simple. In order to comprehend presentation, you need a basic linguistic understanding. You need to know what a genuine sentence is. And here you can see one, a genuine simple clause, which states, I watch your presentation. And you can subdivide this clause into the subject, the agent or actor, the I or you who is watching, then this predicate verb, the action that someone is doing, the I is watching, you are watching. And what are you watching? This presentation, your presentation, it's the object. So in order for a sentence to be simple and complete, you need a subject, the actor, the predicate or verb, the action, and the object towards which the action is done. Then you have a genuine clause or a genuine theme, as I call it. Within my assessment, a theme means a limited bit of information that's aligned with what we will later learn to know as a transcendental medium or structure, or a reme, which means a bit within an overarching scheme of informations that's combined with other types of information, as we will see just in a few seconds. Then you have different types of sentences, different types of simple clauses. Like here you have a subject, I, the verb watch, but then you don't have a proper object. You simply have a predicate adjective. Attentively modifies the watch, so it tells you how you're watching, how you're listening to the presentation. It doesn't tell you what you're watching. So the watching and attentively has not the object of the presentation that we had in the prior clause. It simply modifies the predicate object, the predicate verb. And so lacking an object, we don't deal with a genuine clause, with a clause that has all three bits of information, subject, predicate, and object, but we deal with one that's less than possible. It's degenerate, and it only includes a subject and a verb that's then modified through the predicate adjective. So both of these cases are simple clauses. On the one hand, a genuine simple clause, and on the other hand, a degenerate clause, simple clause. And then if you investigate more complex structures of consciousness and self-expression, you will see complex clauses arise. Complex clauses are simply the combination of two or more simple clauses. In order to combine them, you need a connective. In this case, it's because it's in a certain sense causal. So it's explaining why, or for whatever reason, someone is doing something like watching the presentation or watching attentively because they want to learn this. In this case, assessing based on the two types and based on the transcendental medium that my model presents. And then again, you find a genuine sub or coordinated theme or reme. I want to learn this with the subject I, the verb, the predicate verb, want to learn, and the object did this. And if you have a clause like this, you have two themes, two bits of information. On the one hand, the watching, and on the other hand, the reason for it. So you have two themes or two reams. And that's what you have to keep in mind in order to comprehend the rest of the presentation. And we won't look in sentence structures that are more complex than this one. So it's mostly already the highest level of integration that you need to follow if you want to understand the rest of the presentation, mainly the combination of two themes or two complete or degenerate subclauses into an overarching scheme of information or knowledge. So now let's look what transcendental pluralism is. What's the foundation of the model? What's the meta model? How is it built up? Similar to Terry O'Fallon's stages model or Piaget's ideas on the development from childhood to adolescence, you have four different functions, four iterating transcendentals, and each of them builds a layer of consciousness, and as we'll see later, builds a stage within the layer and substages if we want to get more granular. The first transcendental is identity. So at first, like the infant, you have to identify or sculpture objects from the sensory field. Once you have identified something, have identified an object, you can attempt to invert it, attempt to change it. You can become active and dream up different types of identities, different types of objects that you either want or want to be dissolved. So you get the ability to invert or differentiate and distinguish yourself from a fixed identity. You can dream up new futures. You can imagine different timelines and possibilities and can become more hypothetical and experimental, just as Piaget did show for children that move through different stages into formal operations where they suddenly can apprehend imaginations about different trajectories they could go along and move along with, and not simply certain objects on the outside they are identified with. Both layers are attempted to be equilibrated. However, without a third, it's difficult to get a balance between two different things. And so development shows us the function of reciprocity. Reciprocity means mediation or representation of identity and inversion within the mental space, within awareness, or through thought and reasoning. And these mechanisms then can balance identity and inversion consciously. However, balancing and mediating is not enough. For whatever reason, evolution, or at least human consciousness, drives for wholeness, for structures of the whole, for unities, and therefore the function of synthesis arises as well, binding together reciprocity, inversion, and identity into a structural whole or universal. Within each of these layers, you then can see that identity builds the first stage. At the second stage, inversion is added to identity. And the third stage brings in reciprocity, while the fourth stage culminates within a synthesis. And then with each succeeding layer, the same pattern repeats. All of these functions are grounded within a fifth layer, the so-called non-dual realm, non-dual suchness, within which the origin of the different functions of the different transcendental structures or transcendental media is found. So there's this fifth realm that coordinates and orchestrates the overall developmental pattern that we move through in our lives, and that we can, at the end, supposedly, of our developmental journey, access in its completeness, and from there more consciously and more liberated and with intention reshape the way we flow through the spectrum of consciousness. Now, when we look later at sentences and the assessment structure, we will recognize that each layer can produce as many themes as you have grown through within the layer, which means the first realm, the first layer, can only produce one theme, one bit of information, and this theme can then be subdivided into certain sub-pieces of information, which we coin reams. Then if you move into the second layer of development, secondness, the subtle realm, where you get this agent and imaginative power over the outside realm, the outside world, you have suddenly two sentences, just as we saw it within the example in the beginning. You can align two themes, two bits of information with each other, and then sometimes, depending on your type, fill in different dreams into each of the two subclauses. And then once you move into certainness, the structure becomes triadic, indicating that you now have three bits of information available: identity, inversion, and reciprocity, and build each of them into a bit of information into your utterances and your sentences. And this way it proceeds basically up into fifthness. Over the years, I've done many attempts of correlating my developmental model with other models. Some of these correlations are actually statistical, and others are more approximate. But you can see that every stage that we will look at today has its correlates within cognitive development, such as Piaget's work or Fisher's and Dawson's work. And you can likewise see that there are ego development correlates and moral development correlates. Maybe you likewise recognize that, for example, the 2.4 stage consists of more than one ego development stage. And of course, the way we discern stages is based on different methods, on different assumptions and different strategies. And so it's not always the same trajectory that we find. Even so, in a general way, all of these stage schemes overlap to some degree. And as mentioned before, the pattern from identity to synthesis not only iterates at the level of overall consciousness and at the level of layers, forming different stages, but within each stage likewise. So even so, we depict only complete stages here, such as 2.4, 2.3, 2.2. The model can get more granular within the stage and therefore match the granularity or the different ways of distinguishing within the trajectory that other models provide, and give you some intellectual ideas and possibilities to reason why different models measure different, why they see the distinctions between different stages and layers differently, and so forth. On this slide, we repeat. So we have two layers that we will look at today: firstness and secondness. Firstness means the infant stage of life, so-called Piaget's sensory motor tier, where we only have a first, some identity in the sensory field. The infant starts to name things such as the computer or a cup or the light, and whatever else we can grasp within the phenomenal realm. And then secondness generates a split between a first and a second, generating a subclause or a theme for firstness and a subclause for secondness, and then attempting to equilibrate the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, the object realm, and on the other hand, the agent or dreaming self that attempts to reimagine and reshape through its wants and wishes and needs in the outside reality. And now let's dive into the actual substance of this presentation. The texts, or in this case, summaries written by sixth graders on a story about a girl who gets an umbrella from her piano teacher. And you see the first summary from a child that sounds as follows. The main character tries to hide that her mother is working and her piano teacher takes care of her and her sister. The main character says that she wants the piano teacher to be her mom. She also wants to be like Eugene because he was really good at piano. The main point of the story is to be who you are and not to be who you want to be. The second child or adolescent summarizes the story as follows. The narrator tries to be more like other people than the person she actually is. Therefore, the narrator learned the lesson that you should be yourself and no other. The narrator saw that she would never see her mom again. When the mother got into a car crash, she realizes to start caring more for her family. So you can see two stories. They come up with a similar essence. It's not about being someone else, but about being yourself. But the core message is delivered within a different sentence structure. And we can easily recognize this when we simply count the predicate verbs. So in the first case, you can see the first sentence has three predicate verbs. So predicate verbs, again, if you have a subject, the actor, then you have an action, and the action is the predicate verb. And after the predicate verb, you have an object. And in this case, you can see the first sentence, the second sentence have three predicate verbs. Then the third sentence, the third clause, has only two predicate verbs. And the final clause has even four predicate verbs. Now let's see what this looks like within the second summary. In the second summary, you can see that each of the clauses only contains two predicate verbs. So there is always only subject, predicate, and object in the best case. And how does this come? How is it possible that two children at the same age, in the same grade, come up with very similar summaries of the story, however, voice the core message of the story and their recognitions with a different grammatical structure and a different style of writing, utilizing different amounts of predicate verbs to say something that's on the surface depicting the same message. And that's because the one person is a so-called Gestalt processor and the other person is an analytical type, two ideas that have been coined by Catherine Nelson when she looked at language acquisition. However, we now will not start like Catherine Nelson's from the bottom up, from infancy, then tracking the trajectory into adolescence, which no one has ever done before. So I'm basically the first one who attempted this and succeeded to some degree. But we will descend, so we will start with the most complex utterance in both summaries, and then slowly and gradually move down into infancy to see how these different types of grammatical structures started to grow and blossom out of the ground of our life and developmental journey. So here you see the most complex clause of the first person. It contained for predicate verbs. The main point of the story is to be who you are and not to be who you want to be. So in this case, we can see that the four functions within the layer, identity, inversion, reciprocity, and the synthesis, each get one subclause within the overarching scheme to express themselves. In the second case, on the right-hand side, you can see that there is only a twofold clause. Therefore, the narrator learned the lesson, which the narrator is the subject, the learned is the predicate, and the lesson is the object or the outcome. And in the second case, again, you should be yourself and no other, with you as the subject should be the predicate verb, and yourself and no other as the object. However, when you compare the content of the first and the second sentence, second example, you might recognize that therefore the narrator learned the lesson is much more abstract and much more complicated to express in a certain sense than the main point of the story is to be who you are, because to be who you are could be something visible, something like wearing the clothes that you actually have, or stating that your mother is who she actually is, and not just telling another story. So it's related to observational stuff within the life world, whereas a lesson learned is nothing that can be observed in a concrete way, but it's a subtle thing, an abstract thing, where you have to make up a category that combines and transcends different concrete facts. Those facts that the earlier person concretely expresses. And the same is true for the second part of the clause. You should be yourself and no other. Yourself and no other is a very complex compound, a complex compound category that in a more abstract sense tells the same as the complete sentence of the other person. So we can assume or derive from the comparison of these two sentences that while the first person uses each of the four functions within the layer of development, within secondness, to produce one subclause, the person on the other hand is combining two of these functions in a higher level abstraction, and so comes up with a clause that combines two abstract ideas in comparison or in contrast to a clause that combines four concrete perspectives. And likewise, if you go deeper, you can see that the right-hand person has two genuine subclauses. So both contain, as we already saw, observed, and as I expressed, subject, predicate, and object. Whereas on the other hand, the first person only comes up with two genuine clauses as well, and with two degenerate ones. Because if you look at who you are, this clause lacks an object, so it stops with the predicate verb, and likewise, and not to be lacks any object, and likewise lacks the subject, wherefore both are expressed within the final genuine theme or reme, who you want to be. Below both clauses, you can see the actual scoring templates that we use in Transcendental Pluralism. And they tell a little bit more than the analysis based on combining the four functions within the layer, because the arrows, for example, express the type of combinations between the subclauses, whether they are causally connected, as in this case, or whether they are reciprocal, and so on. And likewise express how the transcendental structures are baked into the overarching scheme through the borders around the circles that show the colors of the different layers from magenta to amber to teal to turquoise. But now let's descend a bit. We take the next simpler clause, move down one stage, one step into the so-called 2.3 stage. The semantic-grammatic field here again contains two types of clauses. On the one hand, the expression of reciprocity, which we see here. The main character says that she wants the piano teacher to be her mom. So you have the act of reciprocity, and you move down from 4 subclauses to 3 subclauses, where the main character says that is the reciprocal act of explaining something. Then you have the inversion, what the person wants. She wants the piano teacher, and then to be her mom as the identity. So the third or the first subclause coordinates 2 other subclauses, where one again is genuine and the final one is degenerate. To be her mom, that's the subject. The subject is expressed within the earlier sentence. And so again, you stay with basically 2 genuine reams or seams, 2 genuine seams and 3 sub pieces of information, so-called reams. Here you see the scoring template, and on the other hand, you see a sentence. She realizes to start caring more for her family when her mom got into a car crash. There you can see that, again, you have one clause that's genuine and that's more abstract, because she realizes to start caring is a sort of compound predicate verb that expresses not something perceptual or perceivable and graspable concretely, like the main character says, and she wants, and to be her mom, which all includes very concrete terminology. But it expresses some internality, a realization that's not visible in the external, but which describes a subtle and abstract process that happens within the person. And this abstract process then is combined with her mom got into a crash as a causal connection or an explanation of the realization. And when her mom got into a crash is something concrete and visible, such as every clause on the left-hand side. However, by this, we don't get this sort of reciprocal structure that interrelates inversion and identity, but you get, on the one hand, the abstraction, the single abstraction, and the single abstraction or totality of internal realization is then projected or connected with something that's perceivable. Again, the scoring template. And so you see that already the left-hand side moves from 4 to 3, whereas the right-hand side stays with 2 subclauses that both are genuine in this case. Now, when we move down to the 2.2 stage, we can see that the left-hand person states she also wants to be like Eugene because he was really good at piano. You again see 2 concrete expressions, to be like Eugene, and to be like Eugene is something concretely perceptible, being good at playing piano. You see the inversion, the person expresses a wish or want, their will and dreams and imaginations. And on the other hand, you have the identity, the outcome. You see how the person descends from 4 to 3 to 2 subclauses in order to generate what's called a free coordination, where 2 independent perspectives are interrelated, because both of these sentences have their own and unique subject, their own and unique predicate, and their own and unique object. On the other hand, you see, again, the other side stays with two subclauses, yet the first subclause now is no longer abstract, and it's no longer genuine or complete. In this case, it lacks the object. The narrator thought that is, in this case, the connective, with the second part, that she would never see her mom again. So the narrator has a thought, and the thought is directly expressed within the second subclause, which is a genuine dream. And because there is no object within the first subclause, you can speak of a free coordination, because for a free coordination, the first subject would not have the second subject as a subordinate or as a sort of object for the predicate, but it would have their own object for the predicate. And so both of them show a similar structure. Both of them now are expressing themselves concretely. Both clauses are dyadic and integrate two themes and two reams. Yet on the left-hand side, you see two complete and genuine subclauses, and on the right-hand side, you see that the first one is degenerate and therefore demands the second one as their object clause and subordinates them in contrast to coordinating one with the other. So finally, and here I made up clauses because the summaries of the school-aged children didn't contain sentences at this stage. We find the 2.1 stage where you can see she was choice about sound for piano is mostly one genuine clause. You have just one subject, one predicate verb, and one object. Yet you can see that the clause is made up of a first predicate, then a verb, then a modification, an adjective, and then you find the object, the sound. And this in part resembles the architecture of our brain that can be subdivided in 4 pieces. The right medial prefrontal cortex, which makes up objects such as a she. The right lateral prefrontal cortex, which deals with behavior and action schemes, and then is combined with the predicate verb. The left prefrontal cortex in the lateral position, which uses the adjective or modifications, modifying grammar, the choice, and then in the midline, the sound of the subject, or again, a sort of object that's relevant for the overall architecture. And this then feeds into fifth, the identity at the 2.1 stage at the next layer. So you can see that the first clause is made up of 4 pieces, arbitrating each of the 4 stages within firstness through a verb or a predicate or a subject, a noun, and adjectives, the object. So fusing each into a short phrase or a complete word. This then feeds in to another additional perspective, in this case her piano, the identity, and so you get a clause that imitates or shows you the shape of reality, someone being joyous about the sound of something that's recognized as an identity, the piano. On the other hand, you can again, on the other side, see that you have a more dyadic clause that starts with I want. So it expresses an identity, a wish that reality should turn out to be in a different way, which is less of an imitation, but more of an ejection, a projection or an expectation towards a way reality should show up or appear, which then is combined with the piano to sound well. I want in this case is a sort of pivot scheme, and it's degenerate. It is only subject and predicate. And in order to be complete, it needs the piano as the object, which then again has its own predicate. So it functions as a subject as well. And some modifying adjective in the end to sound well. But in both cases, you only have basically one subject and one object. However, in the second case, you have these two predicates, making clear that you deal with two distinct subclauses or sentences, and not with a simple clause as on the left-hand side, but already with a complex clause, even if it's built up from degenerate sentences. And so as you see, the whole movement through the layer of secondness showed us that the right-hand person, the right-hand type, is unfolding in this dyadic structure, is unfolding in a dyadic structure that slowly complexifies and then arbitrates its own complexity by becoming abstract. Whereas on the left-hand side, you see the growth from a simple clause to a dyadic complex clause to a triadic complex clause, and then to a quadruplicate or fourfold complex clause, showing or thus explaining why the number of predicate verbs varies in each of their sentences. And now, how is this grounded in early childhood language research? So what Catherine Nelson figured out, there are two types of language acquisition. The first one she called expressive or the Gestalt mode, because it tended to absorb reality into wholes or gestalts, mostly representing a certain truth that appear on the outside, and so oftentimes through onomatopoeia or echolalia, which means the internal imitation of the sounds or shapes, tastes, touch, smells, and so on that appear on the outside, which in the case of a piano would, for example, be the bling blong. And if you look at bling blong, you can again see that it's made up of four pieces, four parts, which combine each of the stages of firstness into a sort of syllable. And that's typical for onomatopoeia to unfold this type of structure. And when you grow out of firstness, seemingly each of these syllables gets arbitrated or substituted through a complete word or short phrase representing the function of identity inversion, reciprocity, or synthesis within the sensory realm. On the other hand, you see the more analytical type, and the analytical type does not use onomatopoeia in any significant way. It rather tends to use nouns, so real words just as adults, and thus abstracts from all four stages of firstness into this sort of word or category. And when we look at developmental psychologists, we can see that James Mark Baldwin, who fits more into the right side, analytical type, looks at language rather as a form of construction, reality construction based on memory control. So we receive certain memories, we combine them with adult language, and once we have a category, a noun, we can control the stream of reality to unfold in the ever same way. Whereas on the other side, when you look at Piaget, who rather falls into the Gestalt type, into the left side typology, you can see that he rather speaks of representation that these words or onomatopoetic representations are not so much in the control of reality into certain shapes, but more an echo of it, the internal representation of the sensory motor layer unfolding in two different shapes and forms. And so it's more postponed and an echo or reiteration of the truth rather than the active and constructive control over reality. Even so, of course, the sensory motor layer provides the means to have reality arise in different ways. On this slide, you can see the most likely routes of these different ways to unfold the developmental trajectory and produce different types of grammars, sentence structures, and words. The so-called branch section of the intraparietal sulcus, so a part of the brain that's related to sequentializing sentence structures, that's shown to correlate whether we see language as referential meaning putting something into an analytical category, or perceiving reality as non-referential, which means interpreting it based on a complex image rather than attending to it through the category or word. But that's just a side notion and hypothesis that has to be tested. So on the one hand, the typological distinction matters when we want to understand human beings, because someone who unfolds the Gestalt way has different capacities and abilities. For example, if you take a 2.2 stage and someone has the ability to hold two distinct subjects with the predicates and objects, they are in a sense already collective, or they can coordinate their perspective and the perspective of someone else, such as in collaborative play and stating, today I will play with the ball and tomorrow you are allowed to play with the ball. So they can do these simple coordinative acts, whereas someone who is rather on the analytical side, not holding two objects, but holding the second subject as their object, is unable to make this act of coordination, but is better suited to control the outcome of an action or the role someone else plays, such as in stated, today I want that you play with the ball. So in this case, the person on the analytical side enables the behavior and allows the other to stay and stick within this nominalization or referential role, in contrast to sort of coordinating the two distinct perspectives. Likewise, if we look at the movement into the reciprocal stage, the Gestalt type start to compare and combine identity and inversion through their actions, which is still quite concrete. So they might perform better when it comes to explaining how to craft something, how the relations of certain pieces have to unfold together in order to get a concrete object on the outside, whereas the analytical type or the right-hand type starts to generate a higher level of abstractness and therefore might be better in inventing ideas of new objects, new categories in reality, under which certain concrete things can be subsumed, or utilizing their mindfulness and awareness, and thus making more complex internal operations with greater ease. And so these people have different skill sets, different capacities, and will flourish with different tasks. But at the same time, overlooking these types as already Lawrence Kohlberg saw with his blindness for certain typological patterns that were distinct from the unfoldment along stages can skew our perceptions, and not seeing the types makes us more biased and blind to, and therefore maybe over-assessing or under-assessing or overvaluing and devaluing certain types of people based on our own preferences and putting them at different stages, even so they actually come from the same territory. So here you see a first example from William Perry's work on ethical and intellectual development in college years. You see that he distinguishes different stages. So he distinguishes stages that unfold from multiplism to relativism to some forms of commitment. And on the right-hand side, you can see a sample from a larger probe. So I just took out a sentence that would fit whatever we analyze today so that we don't move into higher levels of complexity and additional information. So you can see there is some analytical type person if you have more trouble. So trouble is something abstract and not necessarily perceptible. You get more cautious in thinking. Getting more cautious in thinking is likewise abstracted, references internal and subtle processes. And this person lands at position 4, which is relativism. And in transcendental pluralism, the person would land, so this would be a 2.4 clause, but the larger probe lands at the first quarter of the 3.1 stage. Then on the left-hand side, you can see the Gestalt mode, again a sample from a large probe. I think that there's been a tendency this year, because of all I've learned, it is to keep my mouth shut more. You can see that the person here unfolds the quadruplicate structure, and what they show is a behavioral tendency that they keep their mouth shut more open rather than referencing the more abstract recognitions and ideas. And this person falls into Perry's position 2, which is called multiplism. So he lands basically 2 stages earlier, even so it's a very granular state scheme where these positions don't represent full stages in the sense of transcendental pluralism, but more granular subdistinctions. But the transcendental pluralism score of this position is the same. And when you look through Perry's work, you will see and recognize these things, that he has a tendency to put the analytical type a little bit later and more into relativism, whereas he has the tendency to put the Gestalt persons more into the earlier multiplistic position, even so it's not completely consistent. But the confusion definitely has influence, and definitely you can find a bias that makes him treat people different based on a hierarchical scheme and not based on typology, which most likely would be more appropriate, at least in this case. Then we can go to the sentence completion test. We can see that most sentence completions already start, for example, with abstract ideas, such as a girl has a right to, when I'm criticized, or the thing I like about myself is, and I just can stand people who. And if a sentence completion or the sentence stem already starts with abstract words, it limits the response options towards the 2.3 outside view and the 2.4 analytical type, so the right-hand types mostly. So someone who is more Gestalt-like therefore has to express the analytical mode, even so it's much more difficult for them. And so the complete way the sentence completion test is structured will disrupt the Gestalt type's ability to fully self-express, which likewise then will generate stage descriptions that are skewed and biased and have a tendency to better represent the analytical type of thinking and development rather than both types equally. And likewise, the more concrete type of sentence starters, when they talk about sex, when people are helpless, man feels good when, are written in a way that you can't build an actual quadruplicate clause from it. So it's impossible for the Gestalt type, so the left-hand person, to actually express the 2.4 stage. All they can do within their genuine grammar and genuine self-expression through textuality is to show a 2.3 or 2.2 response to the sentences. And this, of course, is very limiting. Likewise, when we look at the stages model of human development, where you have a scoring that's based on the level of abstractness of words, whether they are concrete or subtle, you can see that two clauses scored at the same stage or almost approximately the same stage, for example, within the lexical assessment system, and likewise within Transcendental Pluralism, can fall into quite distinct stages based on the typological predisposition of a person, because the first clause in stages would be scored as something concrete, because all the words within the fourfold scheme are perceptible and concrete and representations of the sensory realm. The person only makes it up to the 2.5 stage, whereas on the other hand, where the person writes because some scientists can study differently, and then scientists might just be watching some different things. The term differently is defined as something abstract, so more abstract than something perceptible. The person comes out at the 3.5 stage, and that's not just one scorer who scored these sentences in alignment with the 2.5 or the 3.5 stage on the other side, but it were two independent scorers, which at least gives us an indication that developmental models that don't perceive these typological distinctions and therefore find proper means to measure them and to value them will fall into either devaluing or overvaluing one of the types over the other. Okay, thank you for watching. This was a presentation. I hope this was fun and insightful to listen, and maybe we see ourselves again at some time. And reach out if you have questions, if you want to know more, let me know.